G'day there folks, I'm Beanie, you're watching Beanie Draws, and in this video I'm bringing you part 2 of how to draw T-Rex versus Indominus Rex. What you're watching here is a time-lapse rundown of part 1, which was the full tutorial of how to draw this, so if you want to watch that, click the description below. Otherwise, hold on to your butts because we're about to take this drawing to the next level. So as you just saw, I'm being a little bit naughty and showing you what the end result looks like before the video is actually finished, but that's because what's on the right hand side is what I had in my mind, which is basically what we're going to be doing. Drawing the background, shading the dinosaurs, and putting a nice epic explosion in there for some cool effects. Before we start on the background, I just wanted to show some screen caps from the scene that this image was inspired by. The background that I drew isn't exactly faithful to the original shot, rather it's a simplified version to illustrate the fact that they're smashing into their surroundings. We're also going to keep the background simple, because otherwise we'll be here forever, and the focus should be on T-Rex versus Indominus Rex. For drawing this particular background, I'm keeping it in a 2-point perspective style. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail explaining what 2-point perspective is. I'll probably explain that in a future video, but essentially the middle line will be the corner of the building, and on the left hand side and the right hand side of that corner will be two sides of the building. Because of the architectural style of it, looks like they're using a lot of planks throughout the building, so we're going to have a lot of fun shattering them up in the debris. We're going to draw some circular lines to start the big boom, and I like to draw a few lines coming out from that big boom so it gives a bit more of a vibe to it. You can also call them action lines because they give the impression of rapid movement. And where there's destruction, there should always be sparks. And when it comes to drawing sparks, don't think too much about it, just be loose, random, and sporadic. Again, it's all about dynamic movement, so you just want to make it as dynamic looking as you can. Another good thing to include when drawing an explosive blast is to draw some cracks in the wood and some chips flying out. We're then going to continue on drawing those planks. You don't have to be too precious about them because they are being shattered up, so draw some straight lines for the edges and some shattered zigzaggy lines for the broken bits. We're going to continue on marking in the basic look of the building, which to be honest I actually kind of find architectural drawing a little bit boring personally, so that's why I tend to keep my backgrounds very minimal and simple. Drawing flames and fireballs however is a completely different story. When drawing this side of the building, I'm keeping a very simple minimal grid structure to help represent the glass, the windows, and the storefronts. We're going to draw even more planks in the middle section, and then continue drawing more loose sketch of the building. We don't need to put in much detail, we're keeping it very simple for now. Then we'll draw in the beginning of the lower part of the explosion. Kind of think of it how you draw a very simple tree. Then we're going to draw a stronger line that defines the center corner of the building. Then we'll draw in a line for the ground, as well as placing in the first windows for this side of the building. Again, it's only going to be very basic, so simple grid structure is all you'll need to draw. And then, because the action was set at nighttime, I'm shading in a large area of the background in black. Because of the way that my drawing program records, it doesn't actually record the stroke as I'm drawing it. Instead, it records the block of shading that I've done. Up until this point, that hasn't been a huge issue because I've been just drawing with smaller strokes, but because of the nature of colouring and shading, use a lot longer of a stroke, so it only recorded the single stroke, not the actual movement of the stroke. However, that being said, I trust you probably know how to colour in large sections of area, so you probably don't need an in-depth description on how to do that particular bit of colouring. After blocking in all the blackness, I started using the eraser tool. You can also just use a normal eraser to erase out some of the black so that it made the edges a little bit sharper. Mind you, if you're doing this traditionally, I would recommend that you're careful when shading in around edges, because if you colour in over Indominus Rex's head, it's going to be a real pain in the butt to erase it so it's nice and tidy. So when it comes to colouring around edges traditionally, it's probably best to keep into what you probably already know, and that's slow down around the lines and colour carefully. And now, we're going to begin colouring in the flames, which is personally one of my favourite things to do after drawing. I generally start colouring in my flames with an orange, and generally speaking, I tend to do the outline of it first. You'll notice that I kind of went with some broader strokes, and the inside of the flame isn't coloured yet. Then, I kind of paint in the inside with a bit of yellow, and yes, I did say paint. Even though I'm drawing it, I kind of treat it like it's painting in a very impressionistic style. I sketch in blocks of colour much like how an artist would paint in blocks of colour. And to get these kind of broad strokes out of a traditional pencil, what you want to do is lay the pencil down at a flat angle where the length of the lead is touching the paper rather than just the tip. Now that we have a nice beginning look for the form of the flame, it's time to add in some sparks. To do this traditionally, your best bet is actually to get some white paint and to paint that over the top of the black. Otherwise, if you use lead to colour in the black, you might be lucky enough to get away with erasing a little bit of that black lead so the white shows up. I also like to add yellow sparks as well. Gives a bit of a nice dynamic range having white and yellow sparks flying everywhere. Also, don't be too particular if the sparks look correct. Just be random, don't add too many sparks, just enough and you'll be fine. Also, at this point I like to add a bit more black into the fire to give a bit more contrast in the lines. And we're going to be doing this a lot more now. We're going to be adding a lot more black to emphasize the details and the contrast. Because at this point, it's no longer just a drawing or a sketch. We're going to be taking this and we're going to be completing it into a finished illustration. Also, at this point, we're going to be doing a lot of refining of detail, but unless I time-lapse it, you probably won't even notice the detail unless I explicitly point it out, like the legs and the shoulders, which you probably just missed. Now this is the point where the benefits of digital art come into play. Technically, you could do this in post-production, but I just found that with Indominus Rex and T-Rex smashing into each other, that Indominus Rex would be putting more of its weight on its left leg to try and brace itself from T-Rex's pushing. Moving that leg back traditionally would be a nightmare. You'd have to erase it and redraw it again, but with digital, you can just simply lasso around it and just move it back. Now I can already hear you complaining, Beanie, I've drawn this with pencil, I can't do that. That's okay, this shouldn't affect you at all. I'm just a real perfectionist when it comes to drawing, and to be honest, you probably don't even need to move it, but I just felt that I wanted to shuffle it over a little bit. Now while we're at the point of adjusting, I've also noticed that its left leg is a little bit lower than T-Rex's right leg. They should be on an equal level. So I've duplicated that foot as a reference, and we're going to erase that foot and draw it again, which I know is annoying, but it'll benefit the drawing in the long run. You can also consider it to be good practice to redraw things again and again if things don't look quite right the first time around. So again, practice makes perfect. Now I didn't entirely erase the foot, I erased it in a way where you can still see a bit of it left as a bit of a template, and we're going to use that to reshape the foot. Notice how we just made the bottom of the toe flatter? The dew claw on the ankle is going to more or less be the same, as well as the top of the toes, but we're going to reshape the ankle as well. I've also repositioned the toe a little bit. I've put a circle to bring it in a little bit closer so it's not going to be quite as long of a toe. Then we're going to redraw the toe claws, finish the top of the toe, and then we're going to finish it all up by drawing those scute scales along the top of its toes. And now after we finish the foot, we're going to start refining those windows a bit more. Now drawing windows can be a bit boring, so I'm going to speed up most of that. Mind you, I will cover some of the shading, and the reason why I use shading is to separate the foreground from the background. We want Tyrannosaurus Rex and Indominus Rex to be the main focus of the image, so we're going to pull everything in the background back using a darker layer of shading so all the attention is on the main focus. And using blocks of shading is a great way to bring in some contrast. The main thing to remember when shading is to go light and loose with your pencil. And now that we've got the background blocked in, it's now time to start rendering and shading in T-Rex and Indominus Rex, which is personally my favourite part after the drawing and the explosion layout. The general rule when it comes to rendering and shading is to imagine where your light source is. Now with this one, the light source is behind T-Rex and Indominus Rex for the most part. Normally, the light source is usually coming from the top, the left, or the right, so it's usually best to figure out where your light source is coming from and using that as your beginning guide. Another thing to remember when rendering or shading your image is that if it was in a 3D space, they wouldn't be flat. Muscles, torsos, and heads and all the other bits of the body are usually rounded, and light is only usually touching the top, the left, or the right side of it. But remember, think where your light source is coming from, and then remember that the other side of that body part will not be actually being hit by light. So in this instance, Indominus Rex's arm is blocking the light from hitting its chest. T-Rex's left leg will be blocking light from hitting underneath its pelvis, and its pelvis and tail will be stopping light from hitting its right calf. So basically, imagine the image as a 3D object, and visualize where the light would be hitting and where the light would be dropping off. So for example, a basketball has less light underneath it because more of the light is above it. So here, I'm shading T-Rex's ankles and knees, and then I'm going to shade in Indominus Rex's calves and feet. Zooming in here so you can see a little bit of the shading detail that I'm putting in T-Rex's head. Then we're going to shade underneath its armpit, putting a few little scale details in there. Then we're going to put a bit of shading into its shoulder, and then we're going to focus a lot of shading into the muscles of the thigh. And here's a close-up example of what I meant by the underneath of the pelvis will cast a shadow on the calf muscle area. After that, we'll focus on rendering the shins and the heels some more, and then we'll shroud the left leg in a lot more shadow. After a while, it becomes a process of building up the shadows bit by bit, layer by layer, getting darker and darker as we build up the layers to get a nice level of contrast throughout. We'll add some subtle shading detail in Indominus Rex's head, and we'll also shade in the shadow that the top jaw leaves on the membrane that goes between the top and bottom jaw. After that, we'll gradually build up the shadow underneath the tail, and of course, because some of the tail that connects to the pelvis is underneath the thigh, that's going to be even darker. And if you make some of your shading a little bit too dark, you can simply erase it lightly and just bring down the intensity of the shadow a bit. Then we'll bring a little bit more shadow to its belly, and then we'll focus our attention on their heads. Rexy has some rather distinctive wrinkles down her neck, so we're going to emphasize those with shadow, and then we're going to add a really nice dark shadow underneath her eyebrow ridge. I kind of find that shadow also helps emphasize the dark, moody emotion that she emits. All joking aside though, it does bring out the eyes a lot more, I find. Now we're going to add even more contrast and detail to the head area with more shadow and dark lines. And then we're going to add some shadow for the indentation of the skull where the ear would be. After this, we'll refine Indominus Rex's head and neck and back some more, as well as building up the shadows in T-Rex's leg, back, and thigh. And also, now that we're working in this area, I also noticed that T-Rex is kind of floating in nowhere, so I'm going to add a little bit of a shadow underneath its foot. And then after that, we're going to start the shading process for the tail, as well as bringing our attention closer in so you can see the skin folds and a little bit of the wrinkles details in the skin for the thigh and the tail. Then we'll continue to build up the layers of the shading in the tail, as well as adding a bit more shading for the ankle area. Now that we've got that done, we're going to add a lot more attention to the shading area for under the feet. While we're doing this, we will be adding little bits of detail here and there, refining a few lines as well, but the focus is mainly building up layers of shading underneath the feet so you get a nice bit of shadow so they don't look like they're floating in the middle of the page and they're actually on the ground. Now from here on, it's mostly going to be refining lines, strengthening some shadows, adding some wrinkle lines here and there, and that's going to be done throughout the entirety of the rest of this image. It's basically going to be a process of layering extra bits of layers onto the shadows subtly, not too heavily now, adding little bits of detail with scales, adding a circle here or there, but at a slow tutorial speed you're not going to notice any of that detail when you apply it. It's just the fine little tiny bits that realistically no one's probably going to notice, but in the grand scheme of things it makes it look a little bit more fleshed out and detailed. We're going to draw in a loose grid pattern here for Indominus Rex's jaw scales, as well as some up here for, I guess you call it the cheekbone, and we'll also include some loose, subtle scales along the top of its skull, which realistically you probably wouldn't have even noticed unless I pointed it out to you. Then we're going to scatter in some scales along its shoulder and hip, and then adding even more scale and shading detail throughout the image. Now we're going to add even more shadow onto the ground, and then we're going to tidy up the background by really emphasizing the darkness of the night sky. Then we'll go through the building and refine the windows and the planks in the wood behind it a bit more, as well as erasing and tidying up the top part of the roof. Then we're going to go through the background and we're going to apply a nice level of shading to the entire image. When shading windows, I tend to do one side of the window a little bit darker than the other side. I find it makes it look a little bit less flat. And then with the rest of the building, I like to use shading and rendering as a method of contrast, bringing the dinosaurs out from the background. This is a classic method where you use negative space as a form of contrast. And you can also see how using darker shading also brings the wooden part of the building out from the storefronts. Then we're going to use some black lines, and we're going to emphasize the cracks, some of the explosive dark clouds, and we're going to really bring out that destructive nature with black lines. After that, it's simply a matter of refining the building detail, refining some of the frames of the windows, adding a nice consistency in the shadows so it's not too dark in some areas and too light in others. So you just ease in and ease out the darkness where it's appropriate. Then we'll refine Indominus Rex's tail more, including its thigh, which we'll scatter a few scales through and give it a nice subtle skin texture. The key to remember when drawing scales is to keep them loose, keep them random, don't be too particular, and that's nice to have some of them big, some of them small, some of them darker, and some of them a bit lighter. You'll also notice I added some lines down the thighs, and that's another good way of doing some skin texture. Then we'll move back down to the feet, where we'll further add to the contrast of the scute scales that run along the tops of the toes. After that, we'll bring our attention back to Indominus Rex's head, where we'll add a few more lines to the grid scale section, as well as drawing a series of scales that will run along its snout, a little bit more over its eyebrow ridge, and in the front of its nose. Then we'll go through and sharpen all the lines for the teeth. And then once that's done, we're going to go through the entire image and we're going to add another layer of scales and detail through the image, and it can be quite a time consuming task, so I've time-lapsed most of this. When it comes to T-Rex's leg, I like to use a bunch of lines that conform to the contours of the form. Now at this point, we kind of have a problem because it looks like Indominus Rex and T-Rex are a little bit too affectionate right now. It kind of looks like Indominus Rex is giving T-Rex a pat on the shoulder. So, to make it look a little bit more like they're fighting and not hugging, we're going to add a little bit of blood, but not too much. We're going to add a little bit of blood to the scratch marks, which is really easy to do. All you need to do is get a red pencil and draw over the top with a black pencil. Then, depending on how deep you want the cut, you can add a few little streams of blood coming down from that cut, and those marks will be a lot lighter. Subtlety is key here, you don't want to go too overboard. Then we'll do the same with its teeth, being very random and very sporadic, you don't have to plan it too heavily. The key here is you want it to make it look like that T-Rex is actually biting into the skin. Then I like to add a little bit to the lips, and then add 1 or 2 drips coming down over the shoulder. And now that I've got that done, I'm going to refine the flames a little bit more, adding some orange in there. We're also going to add a bit of black in there because fireballs do have some black in them. The black also works as a good point of contrast to bring out the dinosaurs' heads a bit more from the destruction. And then we're going to draw some more impact lines and a few more sparks and just things flying out. After doing that, I decided maybe Indominus Rex needs a bit of a tongue, and to be honest, I probably could have done a lot more with the tongue. I actually basically just did that, and that was it. After a brief little jump where you probably didn't really miss much anyway, I'm going to include a bit more sparks and a little bit more flame. I'm now adding a little bit more yellow to the outside of the flame, and that gives it a bit more of a depth to it. Then we need to add a bit more intensity to those flames, so we're going to add white in among the yellow and a bit of the orange. Then we're going to add a bit of orange to those sparks. It's going to give a nice bit of a heated fierceness to the sparks, and it's something I've actually noticed in a lot of posters these days. They're adding a lot of orange to the sparks, so I'm doing the same. And now I'm starting to notice that there's a lot of yellow and there's a lot of white going on, so I'm going to add a bit of orange to add to the body of the flames. When drawing flames, you've got to decide what the intensity of the flame's going to be. If it's just starting, it's mostly white. If it's kind of in the middle, near the end, it's kind of got more of an orange or red vibe to it. So just decide what kind of explosion you want, and then decide which of the yellows, the oranges, or the reds that you want to put in. Now we've pretty much finished the explosion for the most part, and to be honest, pretty much the entire image. I'm just going to add a little bit more shadow into the flames just to give them a bit of depth. And as we finish refining the clouds, I've noticed that it's pretty much engulfed all the detail, the debris that we drew in before, so I'm just going to redraw some planks in there just to give it the impression that it actually is smashing into some wooden planks of a building. Now with all that done, I'm going to add a few more bits of detail like some wood chips flying out, a few sparks, and from this point on, it's really just about adding those last few details to finish off the image, just giving it a nice bit of polish. So we're going to add some sparks, those white sparks, just to finish off the explosion, and then we'll finish off T-Rex by adding a few scales along its back, along its hip bone, along its tail, along its neck, and then we'll add the last few details into its head, including its snout, along the ridge of its ears, and then also putting the last few scales along Indominus Rex's mouth and the top of its head. So just in case you miss it, I'm just going to play it again one more time, a little bit slower, so you can pick up all the detail that's been put in there. We'll be drawing scales and wrinkles along T-Rex's snout, right here, and then we'll be moving it down towards the back of the ear, over here, and then after we've drawn those scales, we'll move up towards Indominus Rex again, where we'll draw the scales along the top of its lip, down the bottom of its jaw, and along the top of its head. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully you learned something from this tutorial, and if you did, be sure to give it a like, and also email me your results, beaniedraws@hotmail.com, or you can tag me on Instagram, beanarts. That's a profile name that I use under Instagram, but if you type in Beanie Draws in the search, you'll be able to find me as well. And if you do that, I'll be sure to include you in the next shout out video, whenever that is. But until then, thank you so much for watching. If you're not already subscribed, make sure you hit that bell notification so you know when my new videos pop up. I'm looking forward to showing you even more awesome content in the future, but until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Cheerio for now.